Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, where our Hogan Lovells panel will discuss the outlook of technology policy in the 118th Congress. Before we kick things off, I just wanted to briefly go over a few housekeeping notes. Firstly, this webinar is being recorded. We are going to offer a CLE credit for your attendance in today's webinar. The CLE forms were emailed to registrants yesterday, but there will also be a follow-up email which will include the same forms, a copy of our presentation, as well as a link to this recording. Also, we wanted to address that Chatham House rule will apply to this webinar. And finally, if anyone has a question they would like to submit to our panel, please use the Q&A box located in your Zoom window. We'll have a team member monitor that and deliver those questions to our panel. So next, I'd like to introduce our panel for today. We have Katie Milner, partner in the Technology and Telecommunications practice. We have James Denville, partner in our Privacy and Cybersecurity group. And we also have Ches Garrison and Ari Friedman, both counsels in our Government Relations and Public Affairs team. And with that, we'll get the presentation going. I'll pass it off to Ches Garrison.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today. My name is Ches Garrison. Just a little bit by way of background, I joined the Government Relations team here at Hogan Lovells a little over a year ago after spending about a decade on and off in the United States Senate as a staffer, most recently for Senator Sheldon Whitehouse on the Senate Judiciary Committee. Dave, if you can go to the next slide. I'm going to just give a brief overview of the sort of the lay of the land that we are thinking about as the new Congress kicks off before we sort of get into specific issues. And so I sort of wanted to start off, there's a new Congress. It's obviously a divided government, which is the first time in a little while. So we're expecting a lot of activity in the tech space. And despite a lot of reports of gridlock and dysfunction in Washington, I wanted to kick things off with an anecdote or observation that Senator Mark Warner gave at a panel he spoke on at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. He started off his remarks sort of on tech policy and the outlook for the next couple of years by just noting that the last few years, Congress has really made an unprecedented level of investment in the tech industry. Things like the CHIPS and Science Act, the Infrastructure Bill, and the Inflation Reduction Act all really provided billions of dollars to spur innovation and growth in the tech industry. But one area where there has not been a lot of progress in Congress is in sort of tech policy and issues that we're going to discuss today, like privacy, content moderation, and competition. So Dave, if you go to the next slide. So despite the lack of progress, there is no lack of interest in the tech industry and tech regulation in Congress, and just from both parties. So just sort of as an example, I included here in this slide a couple quotes, one from a recent op-ed that President Biden submitted to the Wall Street Journal, sort of talking about his tech policy agenda and what he wants to see Congress accomplish. And then another quote from Speaker Kevin McCarthy from late last year, where he sort of laid out the incoming House Majority's tech agenda. And so as you can see here, there's actually a fair amount of commonality between the two statements. Both mention privacy, both mention content moderation sort of in different terms, both mention competition. So that seems like, here's a lot of areas where there's going to be a lot of areas and opportunity for bipartisan support. We don't really see a lot of that in a lot of issues. I think some issues like focusing on China competition and data privacy, there actually is opportunity for bipartisan support. But what we're really expecting this Congress is really conflicting and contrasting approaches to how to regulate the tech industry from both parties and both bodies. So I think we are expecting the tech industry to face a lot of whiplash. Hearing one thing or getting investigations from the House on certain sets of issues, and then even on the same issues in the Senate side, having very different legislative and investigative approach from the Democrats. So, and one note I think that has sort of gotten lost in the weeds is the Democrats did pick up a seat in the 2022 election, and that gives them 51 seats in the Senate, which will make their lives much easier, moving nominees, moving bills out of committee, and also investigations. So, while the 50-50 power share did broker some bipartisan work, I think Senate Democrats are going to have an opportunity to sort of more fully pursue their agenda. So Dave, we go to the next slide. And just to sort of set the table, this slide lays out a number of the committees where we think are going to see a lot of action in the tech legislative and investigative space on the House, and also the jurisdictions that each committee have. And I will note that jurisdiction is sort of in the eye of the beholder. And so while, the Judiciary Committee here, does have things like competition and antitrust, and energy and commerce, and Senate commerce are sort of more the realm of data privacy. Creative chairmen and members can find ways to shoehorn legislation and hearings into their committee's jurisdiction. So the jurisdiction is not set in stone. But where we expect a lot of action are the House and Senate Judiciary Committees, the new House Select Committee on China, and then both oversight and investigations committees. And I will also note that each of these committees has their own oversight subcommittee, where there will also be a lot of action, particularly in the House Judiciary Committee. Chairman Jordan's new subcommittee on the weaponization of the federal government, I think, is going to be a fertile ground for investigations especially into the tech industry, and potential, alleged cooperation between the Biden administration and congressional Democrats and the tech industry on issues like content moderation and ESG. So that's sort of the lay of the land as we're sort of looking at this big picture. And now I think we'll turn it over to James to sort of walk through the outlook in more detail in the privacy landscape.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And again, James Denville, I'm a partner in the privacy and cybersecurity practice, Hogan Lovells, based in Washington, D.C. And delighted to talk to you today about the U.S. privacy landscape and hopefully where we're heading. For little over a decade now, I've been helping companies navigate the privacy compliance issues that arise when you're dealing with innovative data uses and technologies, and trying to leverage the data that you're collecting and also protecting it at the same time, and particularly in the face of perhaps obsolescent laws that regulate these data uses and data collection and innovative technologies. So what I would say is in the past few years in particular, the US privacy landscape has become increasingly complex. Some people might call it a mess. Some people might even use more choice words than that. I think the reason is, you can see, is that, global compliance can be challenging. You've got data doesn't respect boundaries, so it flows back and forth across countries, and different countries have different frameworks for regulating privacy, so it becomes a challenge. But that can become even more challenging when you see those same issues arising within a single country and across multiple states, as we have here. And in the US, for quite some time, businesses could focus on some sector-specific privacy laws, like maybe Gramm-Leach-Bliley in the financial sector, HIPAA in the health sector, and other sector-specific laws. And then there was a general consumer protection framework lying on top of that, mainly influenced by the Federal Trade Commission under Section 5 of the FTC Act, regulating unfair and deceptive acts and practices with data. But over the years, as there became growing scrutiny in the press and from privacy advocates and others, whether those were concerns about private or government surveillance issues or potential adverse impacts to individuals with the ways that their data was being used, and an increasing awareness, I would say, about how Europe in particular was regulating data privacy, we began to see sort of more and more calls for regulating privacy. Now, in the absence of federal action in terms of any comprehensive privacy law, which would, like in the Europe with the general data protection regulation, having nothing like that here in the US, we started to see states move in, and that began in California, as it has with a lot of privacy regulation or data security regulation in the US. California was at the forefront, and in 2020, a comprehensive privacy framework took effect called the California Consumer Privacy Act, which has recently been amended. And these were establishing broad rights and obligations for companies processing personal information regarding individuals. So that started in 2020, and now coming up by the end of this year, we'll have at least 5 state laws. We'll have laws in California, Colorado, Connecticut, Utah, and Virginia. Again, these are fairly comprehensive privacy laws, with the exception of California. They all just focus on traditional consumer data, so people operating in their family, household, or personal contacts. It does not apply to B2B or to HR-related data. California does extend that far, like the European laws would. But we now have these 5 laws. And as you could possibly imagine, each state has tried to outdo each other in the way that these laws are. It's not enough just to adopt the same law. They want to make sure it's a little bit different. And just to give a flavor of that, for example, there's, each of the 5 state laws regulates sensitive personal information. But the definition of sensitive personal information differs. In California, for example, precise geolocation is included along with a range of information regulated at the European level, like trade union membership, philosophical or religious beliefs, health data, and the like. But also California lumps in contents of certain communications or account credentials as sensitive data. But in a state like Virginia, we're limited essentially to precise geolocation data, citizenship and immigration status, maybe information regarding children. So the definition of what counts as sensitive information differs, and the way it's regulated differs. In Virginia, you may have to obtain opt-in consent from individuals before you process their precise geolocation. Whereas in California, there's an opt-out. I'll limit the use of my sensitive personal information right that individuals will have. Now, this creates challenges not only for compliance, trying to get your compliance framework wrapped around what data to collect, what are the obligations for different individuals in different states, but that also creates challenges for describing how you're dealing with privacy to your stakeholders, to consumers, for instance, in an online privacy policy. How do you provide a nice, clean, easy to understand privacy notice that describes how you're collecting sensitive personal information and what rights individuals have, when what counts as sensitive personal information is going to differ by state and the rights they have is going to differ by state? So to navigate increasingly these U.S. privacy compliance obligations, companies are needing to, try to fit their square pegs into the round holes that are established by different privacy laws. And again, as I said, at the moment, we've got the 5 laws that will be in effect by the end of 2023. And I am sure we will see more states enact privacy laws within the coming year. Now, this is driving pressure, and I think this is one of the big keys to where we may see some federal action on the privacy landscape. So we've got this patchwork of comprehensive privacy laws, but also fueling the need for it is we've got a patchwork of specific laws whether it's regulating biometrics. You've got 3 state laws which essentially require consent for biometrics: Illinois, Texas, and Washington. Other states may move into that, whereas for most states, you don't need consent expressly for collecting biometrics. AI is now being regulated differently. New York City, for example, is now requiring employers to conduct bias audits of any AI tools that they're using to support their employment decisions. And you also see how the former regulations focusing on communication secrecy, like wiretap laws and similar, are now impacting how companies do business, because needing the consent to collect communications information is now being seen as where, if you're deploying cookies on your website, creative plaintiffs' attorneys are trying to use the communication secrecy laws and their private rights of actions to sue companies without obtaining consent to have third-party vendors collect that information on a company's website. So all of these, differing regulations, whether it be in comprehensive privacy laws or specific types of data collection, and the requirements varying across the states, are really driving some needs for there to be federal legislation. And so, for all Congress has been working on legislation for nearly a decade, we haven't reached a deal. Now, in the last Congress, there were, maybe a couple of dozen privacy bills introduced. And late last year, we were hopeful for a little bit that Congress was poised to maybe enact some legislation. House Energy and Commerce Chair Frank Pallone, he had agreed with his Republican counterpart and Senator Roger Wicker, lead Republican on the Commerce Committee, and they were advancing the American Data Privacy and Protection Act, AADPA, as a comprehensive privacy framework. that would give broad data handling requirements for companies and for common carriers and nonprofits, extending to them. It would include limits on the types of data that you collect, how much you could collect, provide certain rights to individuals, like rights to access, correct, delete, requiring companies to provide opt-outs for targeted advertising or certain use cases. So the same types of protections that we're seeing under a lot of the state laws, but trying to establish it at a federal level. Now, Senator Maria Cantwell, Democrat from Washington, who chaired the Senate Commerce Committee, she objected to the deal, and the deal didn't go forward. The biggest sticking points, and these are not the only sticking points, but two of the core sticking points are on the one side, trying to eliminate any private right of action. In the tech space, we've certainly seen, whether it's in Illinois with their biometrics laws or with these, wiretap laws impacting pixels, any law which has a private right of action is going to create some challenges for companies, because you've just got a creative plaintiff's bar that is going to try to seek some quick fixes in terms of generating money by just focusing on the private rights of action and statutory damages to seek class actions against companies that seem to be violating those. So that's one sticking point, is you've got a bunch of stakeholders, certainly on the business side, trying to push for no private right of action, having it being regulatory enforcement, whether it be at the federal level, at the FTC or another agency, or maybe in combination with states' attorney generals, which has been the common situation for most federal privacy laws. On the other side is preemption. One of the core drivers why we would like to get rid of this patchwork of state privacy regulation is to have preemption, have a federal law that will preempt the state laws so that we can have a harmonious, uniform regulation of privacy, particularly where data is flowing across state boundaries with ease. So it'd be nice to have a one-stop shop for privacy regulation. But you have, particularly from the California stakeholders on the Hill, pushback on that. They view their law as one of the leading laws. They don't want to lose any of the protections that they've established, and they want to retain the ability to regulate privacy in the way that they see fit. So they would, at minimum, like to see a federal law create a floor, but allow for the states to regulate further if they see fit. So those have been the sticking points on the privacy legislation in the past. We're also seeing potentially for the coming year, besides movement on a comprehensive law, maybe the Kids Online Safety Act, which will require internet applications and websites to set up safeguards, and helping protect minors' personal data, allowing parents to monitor how the algorithms and targeted advertising are going to impact children. Also, potentially the Children and Teens Online Privacy Protection Act, that's sponsored by Markey and Cassidy. That would regulate the collection from individuals under the age of 16. There seems to be a push now to recognize that COPPA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which applies to data from children collected online who are under 13 years of age. There's a growing move to try to extend that from 13, at least up to 16, potentially up to 18. So we're seeing a number of moves, particularly focus on children's data. Seems increasingly important to a lot of stakeholders on the Hill, and the increasing pressures, I think, on businesses, and that I think the Hill is going to start to recognize with this patchwork of state privacy laws, the 5 that we have so far, and likely more to come, which may actually change the way that privacy is viewed, and may give some extra hope for privacy legislation in this coming year. And Ches, I'm wondering if you wanted to talk just briefly, perhaps, about how the changing, particularly in the House, how the changing leadership may influence the negotiations or the prospects for privacy legislation in the coming year.
Sure. Yeah, I would anticipate that the new chair, McMorris Rodgers, will continue to work. She's been a pretty dogged proponent of trying to reach an agreement on a federal data standard. I'd imagine that those talks between Energy and Commerce and Senate Commerce will continue. I think, early on, there will probably partisan issues will probably prevail and dominate in the House. But I think quietly behind the scenes, negotiations will continue to go on a bipartisan basis. They got pretty close to a deal last year, so I don't think there's going to be a lot of interest in going back and relitigating issues that sort of have already been hammered out over, years now of negotiation. So I think, run silent, run deep would be my advice to, or if I was still a staffer, would be my advice to my boss as we try to negotiate and try to get to an agreement here, and trying to keep the data privacy issue sort of out of the bigger politics of other tech issues that we will expect sort of grab headlines over the next few months. And on the Senate side, I think it sort of remains to be seen. Senator Wicker was the former ranking member of the Senate Commerce Committee. He moved over to take over that ranking member of Armed Services. That leaves Senator Cruz now as ranking member. I think that's going to be a different dynamic as how Senator Cruz works with Senator Cantwell. Again, having Dems with 51 seats makes it easier for Chairman Cantwell to move bills out of her committee should she want to, and will not need added floor votes if she can't get because she'll have a majority in the committee. Senator Wicker on privacy also worked very hard and was sort of a leader in this space, and sort of had the ability, because he had been ranking for a long time, to bring other Republican members with him on issues, and he could sort of give them cover. I think it remains to be seen what Senator Cruz's ranking membership will look like, and whether he'll sort of have the same coattails that Senator Wicker had.
And I would say, I think there's one of the things that will be changing this year in particular that may influence this is just the experiences that people are going to have with these varied privacy laws. I mean, for some time we've had these calls, for at least a decade and probably more, for Congress to take action and establish some federal privacy laws in a comprehensive manner. And there's been, the battle on the privacy advocates and certain stakeholders on the consumer side tend to be really focused on establishing really broad substantive rights and would like to see a private right of action. They think that's important. And on the business side, there's been a recognition that it would be useful to have a harmonious set of privacy laws to avoid this patchwork that people foresaw coming, but not necessarily wanting to grant a private right of action that's going to really benefit, the plaintiff's bar. But then I think the thing that's going to change is, instead of just those two voices being stuck and arguing, and where it's we want to make sure consumers have rights versus, well, yes, but we don't want to bankrupt businesses, particularly small and mid-sized businesses, based on the plaintiff's bar being aggressive with private rights of action. As we now see multiple privacy frameworks come into play with different rights, different definitions, different terminology, I think there's going to be a consumer experience potentially where you'll see consumers confused by the experience and the framework, and that may lead to a drive to, let's come up with a harmonious single way of regulating this. I think there's at least potential for that in the coming year.
Yeah, I'd agree with all that.
Right, and with that, hand it off to my colleague, Katie.
Thanks, James. My name is Katie Milner. I am a partner in the Communications, Internet, and Media practice here at Hogan Lovells. And I'm going to walk through a few issues in tech and telecom that are likely to be the subject of debate and potentially legislation, and offer my takes on where some of these controversial issues are going. So leading off on the next slide here, the first topic I wanted to flag was the issue of content moderation. This issue relates to the scope of the rights of platforms such as social media companies and sites that host any sort of user-generated content to host this type of speech and content without being legally responsible for what's said. The basis of this right stems both from the First Amendment, but also Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And Section 230 has certainly become a buzzword over the last couple of years. Under Section 230, the party responsible for unlawful speech online is the person who said it, as opposed to the website where they posted it or the app they used to share it or any other third party. So platforms have enjoyed immunity for their decisions to host or to restrict third-party content based on this Section 230 authority. This 1996 law has become the subject of a lot of debate over the past few years as social media platforms have gained users, which are now the billions, and gained influence. And there's been a lot of debate over the scope of this influence in things like elections and world events. So we've seen bipartisan calls for reform of Section 230, but the criticisms from the different parties have targeted different aspects of social media platforms' content moderation. On the Republican side, we've seen arguments that Section 230 enables social media platforms to silence conservative speech, to engage in censorship and bias, Whereas on the Democrat side, we've seen critiques that the platforms have been allowed using Section 230 to escape liability for failing to moderate hate speech or failure to moderate disinformation. Just a few days ago, we saw President Biden weigh in on this issue in his op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. He urged Republicans and Democrats to unite to, I quote, hold big tech accountable. He reiterated his calls to amend Section 230 in ways that would expose tech platforms to more lawsuits over content moderation, and advocated for rules forcing social media platforms to be more transparent about how their algorithms work. And we've seen senators and representatives from both sides of the aisle echo these calls for reforms. We've also seen states getting involved in the absence of federal legislation so far to pass their own content moderation policies in various ways. An overlaying factor to be aware of here is that the Supreme Court is also looking at these issues. About a month from now, the Supreme Court will be hearing arguments in Gonzalez v. Google, which is a case arguing that YouTube's algorithm recommended videos that incited violence that resulted in the death of a woman in a terrorist attack. The Supreme Court's also hearing a case involving whether Twitter, Facebook, and Google can be sued on the theory that they abetted terrorism by showing different or recommending different content on their platforms. I mentioned those state initiatives as well, and as soon as today or early next week, we'll hear if the Supreme Court will be reviewing the Texas and Florida laws, which involve barring online platforms from taking down certain political content. So amidst this backdrop, I think we will likely continue to see bills introduced that take different approaches at reforming Section 230. I think that'll happen both before, during, and after the Supreme Court activity, but it could be in some ways reactive to what we see coming out of the court. And the outcome of the Supreme Court's analysis on Section 230 could drive more hearings, could lead to more focused legislation on various topics, or it could even drive toward a bipartisan agreement on what specifically needs to be fixed about Section 230. So the odds of passage here, I'm definitely hearing some skepticism about true Section 230 reform this year, but I think there is interest and it'll continue to be a subject of debate. Moving on to my next topic, net neutrality is back. So you may remember this debate from a few years ago. Broadly speaking, net neutrality involves the prohibition of broadband internet service providers from engaging in discriminatory practices like blocking certain sites, throttling speeds, or enabling consumers to pay for consumers or platforms to pay for prioritization online. This was a very hot button issue a few years ago. The FCC adopted net neutrality rules in 2015 that proposed greater regulations on internet service providers that were later repealed by Republican appointee Chairman Pai in 2017. And ever since that time, there have been calls for a legislative solution to enshrine net neutrality protections. Last year, we saw Democratic senators introduce the Net Neutrality and Broadband Justice Act, which would reclassify broadband internet access service as a telecommunications service under the Communications Act. This is important because that reclassification would give the FCC greater latitude and a firmer footing of authority to impose net neutrality requirements. Chairwoman Rosa Wersel, the current chair of the FCC, has said that an act of Congress would be the most surefire way to bring back net neutrality rules. But I also note, as Chairwoman Rosa Wersel did, that the FCC can regulate on its own. So the big question here is what's going to happen with the FCC, which has spaces for 5 commissioners, but is currently only staffed with 4, 2 from each party. President Biden has nominated Democrat Gigi Sohn to be the 5th FCC commissioner, but she would need to be confirmed by the Senate She was originally nominated by Biden in October 2021, but has not been able to get pushed through yet. This is important for net neutrality because the FCC is going to need those 3 Democratic commissioner votes to move forward, and also not just on net neutrality, but take action on more partisan priorities. So the 5th commissioner vote is definitely one to watch, and we'll see if Congress is able to give the FCC more direction on what they would like to see for net neutrality. This has been one of President Biden's priorities. It popped up in his executive order last summer on promoting competition in the American economy. I'll flag quickly just a few other issues to watch from the FCC that would impact the FCC. Next slide, please. So I think this is a universal concern that definitely stands to impact the tech and telecom space. We've seen great scrutiny of Chinese-made technology products and services. I expect this to continue. This has been a bipartisan issue. There are data privacy and national security concerns related to Chinese technology products and services. And I think we'll see both inquiries and perhaps additional legislation that could crack down on Chinese-owned tech companies that do business in the US or have US-based subsidiaries. A fun one to talk about is always TikTok. A lot of news on that topic. The No TikTok on Government Devices Act was passed in the omnibus spending bill at the end of last year, which prohibits TikTok from being downloaded or accessed through federally issued devices or networks. We've seen several governors ban the app on state devices as well. And there's been rising bipartisan interest on taking this a step further and banning TikTok across the US. Congressman Mike Gallagher, in particular, has been very vocal on efforts to ban TikTok. And the House Select Committee on China may be influential on next steps here. And we've also seen FCC support for this initiative, particularly Commissioner Brendan Carr has been vocal about a ban on TikTok. But it's not just that one. I think any sort of Chinese-based manufacturing of tech products, services, other apps, investments are going to be under scrutiny here. Another issue with a rather short fuse is the FCC's Spectrum Auction Authority. Back in 1993, Congress authorized the FCC to auction spectrum for commercial use, and this has resulted in trillions of dollars in revenue for the U.S. Treasury since then. This authority expires March 9th, and some hope that with the need to reauthorize spectrum auctions, that other telecom issues would get lumped in with that effort. There's interest in spectrum pipeline issues, such as use of the 3.1 to 3.4, 5 gigahertz band. This band has been contentious due to the Department of Defense's current use of it and the need to accommodate federal users. There are other projects that we may see lumped in with a Spectrum Auction Authority extension, such as funding for next generation 911 upgrades across the country, funding for the FCC's so-called rip and replace program, which replaced Chinese equipment that had been found to pose a national security threat in wireless networks, and other projects such as workforce training or middle mile upgrades, and perhaps NTIA studies of additional spectrum pipeline issues. So I'll pop there. I welcome your questions, but I would expect to see continued interest in these topics from the 118th Congress. And I'll turn it over now.
Thanks, Kate. I'm going to talk quickly about competition and antitrust legislation that we may expect in the next Congress. Dave, if you want to go to the next slide. So last year with Democrats in control, we saw a lot of activity in this space. It was primarily led by Senator Amy Klobuchar, who chairs the Senate Antitrust Subcommittee, and Representative David Cicilline from Rhode Island, who was the Democratic chair of the House Antitrust Subcommittee. But there was bipartisan interest and support on these issues. And on the House side, Representative Ken Buck from Colorado, who's a Republican, was very supportive and worked closely with Cicilline. And on the Senate side, Senator Lee and Senator Grassley on varying bills both worked in trying to get a coalition of Republicans to support various competition bills. But there was also a lot of bipartisan opposition, or skepticism is maybe a lighter way to say that, to the legislation, to these pieces of legislation as well. Not only was the California delegation skeptical of efforts to crack down on competition issues in the tech industry, but issues were also raised around national security, the effect the legislation might have on content moderation. And as the Congress went on, there was increasing Republican skepticism and opposition to the direction the FTC and DOJ antitrust were taking on regulating mergers and sort of the Biden administration's broader antitrust positions. So we would expect, though, with Democrats still in control of the Senate, Senator Klobuchar to continue to push for her legislation. The three big ones I laid out here is the American Innovation and Choice Online Act. You guys probably heard a lot about this last year if you were following this space. This would prohibit various self-preferencing practices for some of the largest tech platforms. Another piece of legislation is the Open Apps Market Act, which would open up app markets and app stores to more third-party participation. And finally, a bill that sort of caught some momentum late last Congress is the JCPA, which would allow news organizations to band together to negotiate with online platforms, which would be an antitrust violation, but this then would exempt them from antitrust as they participate in those negotiations collectively. We expect this year there will be, with the Republican House, there'll be a lot less interest in getting deep into competition issues. We'd expect their focus more to be sort of in the areas that Katie just talked through on content moderation, especially. But we do expect, especially on the House side, a lot of focus on the FTC and DOJ antitrust sort of pushing back on the Biden administration's position. So all this is to say, but I will say, I think as other investigations continue, if the relationship between the tech industry and particularly House Republicans gets more acrimonious, House Republicans could look at some of these antitrust bills sort of as a cudgel to push back on the tech industry. So I do think there is some path for, in the right set of circumstances, more general Republican support on these bills. But I also expect Senator Klobuchar to remain active, pushing them on the Senate side and pushing for hearings and investigations into this space. So with that, I will turn it over to Ari to talk through how all these issues are going to play out in the investigations space.
Thanks, Ches. Appreciate it. I'm Ari Friedman. I'm a counsel in Hogan Lovells Government Relations Practice in Washington. Appreciate you all joining us today. I'm going to walk us through a few slides on what to expect in terms of congressional investigations from the 118th Congress as relates to the tech industry. In short, a lot, and from both sides of the aisle. As my co-panelists have discussed, Republicans and Democrats both have their own sets of grievances against the tech industry, and they're already gearing up to hold the industry accountable. Thanks, David. We would anticipate that a closely divided Congress would be unlikely in general to yield the cooperation necessary to pass big ticket legislation in most of the areas that my co-panelists have discussed. And even if such cooperation were to occur, the more constant dimension to expect over the next 2 years will be sustained congressional inquiries into the tech industry. Now, as the slide shows, House Republicans and Senate Democrats have their own reasons for focusing on the tech industry. And in general, these grievances against the industry diverge from one another, although there could be some bipartisan investigative activity on content moderation. The point is that House Republicans and Senate Democrats have enough of what I would call grievance fuel to burn through for the foreseeable future. In general, we see House Republicans as more eager and arguably more organized to scrutinize the tech industry than Senate Democrats, at least at the outset of the new Congress. As Ches and a number of my other co-panelists have discussed, the issues are now familiar to you. So for House Republicans, allegations of censorship of conservative speech, As I mentioned, there's potential for cooperation with Democrats on content moderation. Tech industry ESG policies. This has become another one of these buzzwords, ESG, 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 ESG. Republicans have come to believe that it's not limited to the tech industry, but many elected Republicans believe that corporate boardrooms are excessively driven by their shareholders' preferences with respect to ESG concerns, and that those concerns have sort of replaced a more straightforward return on investment mentality. And so, it's kind of hard to legislate on that issue, but it is certainly more straightforward to bring in private sector executives and wring them out for, in Republicans' view, focusing excessively on ESG concerns over return on investment as a guiding principle. From a Senate Democrat perspective, the issues are also now somewhat familiar to you. As Ches mentioned earlier, Democrats have repeatedly talked about their frustration over social media platforms not doing enough to crack down on hate speech and misinformation on their platforms. There's also, as James mentioned earlier, data privacy policies certainly come into play, cybersecurity and kid safety online, and finally, algorithm discrimination. Next slide, please. I think it's worth putting a spotlight on a few of the standing committees, as well as new, especially impaneled or select committees that have been stood up on the House side. As a former House staffer myself, I do have something of a House bias, but I think objectively, with House Republicans having been in the minority for the last couple of years, in all of the conversations we've had, in all of the public statements that incoming chairmen of House standing committees have themselves released, it's very clear that there is a tremendous amount of pent-up desire among House Republicans to be extremely aggressive when it comes to oversight and investigations. And frankly, they haven't been waiting for committees to be organized. They're letting letters fly. I will say that folks understandably focus on subpoena power. And in short, the chairman of standing committees in the House will wield subpoena power, and generally speaking, do not have to receive permission from their ranking members in order to issue subpoenas. Now, that makes it seem somewhat straightforward to issue a subpoena, but I would add that our understanding is that the Speaker's office, which does have to authorize subpoenas, the Speaker's office does not believe in the proliferation of the subpoena as an end in and of itself. We understand that the Speaker's office will be somewhat judicious in the use and issuance of subpoenas, and so all that's to say, the incoming chairman of standing committees in the areas of jurisdiction that we've been talking about over the last 45 minutes or so have already been demonstrating something of a record going back to last Congress in issuing letters and now reissuing letters at the outset of the 118th Congress, even before committees have gotten organized, attempting to establish a record of, essentially non-compliance, whether it's from the Biden administration, but increasingly the private sector. And so I wanted to spend just a few minutes talking about some of these panels in particular. So the House Judiciary Committee, Congressman Jim Jordan, certainly not a wallflower. He has been out of the gate early. He sent a letter in mid-December to Apple, Amazon, Alphabet, Meta, and Microsoft, essentially saying that the Biden administration has been colluding with big tech to censor, silence, or reduce the reach of certain information and viewpoints, i.e. conservative viewpoints. And to that end, the House of Representatives has voted to impanel a new select subcommittee that will be under the umbrella of the Judiciary Committee, called the Select Subcommittee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government, that Ches mentioned earlier. Our understanding is that Chairman Jordan is likely to chair this select subcommittee in addition to his duties as the full committee chair. And you know, the mandate for this new select subcommittee on the weaponization of the federal government is somewhat ambiguous, but if you look at the text of the authorizing resolution, there is essentially an allegation here about collusion between the executive branch and private sector to engage in some combination of illegal or unethical activities against U.S. citizens. Exactly what that means remains to be seen, although it seems reasonable to assume that the unlawful or improper sharing of data between the private sector and the federal government is what's being contemplated here. The idea or the push behind the select subcommittee came from House conservatives, and the members of this panel have yet to be announced. Next slide, please. As Katie alluded to or mentioned a few minutes ago, the other potentially major player on the scene is another newly authorized select committee, and this will be its own entity, won't be folded into a standing committee. This is the House Select Committee on China. Representative Mike Gallagher will chair the panel. He's a China's hawk's hawk, but is an insider's insider as well. He's a former staffer and an academic to boot, and has pledged over and again that he is not just willing but eager to work with Democrats on what he and many people in Congress view as the foremost challenge to the U.S., certainly from an economic perspective and arguably from a security perspective as well. The panel itself will have a very wide-ranging mandate. It's worth just reading it for a moment. The authority of the Select Committee shall be to investigate and submit policy recommendations on the status of the Chinese Communist Party's economic, technological, and security progress in its competition with the United States. Under that mandate, one could fit quite a lot. Chairman Gallagher and other stakeholders affiliated with the Select Committee, including the Speaker, who was instrumental in driving this Select Committee into fruition, have kind of outlined in broad strokes their expectations and the agenda, although a lot of the details remain to be seen. What Chairman Gallagher has said recently on January 11th, specifically in an interview with Hugh Hewitt, a conservative radio talk show host, is that he does expect big tech companies to cooperate with the panel, and he singled out Disney and ESPN as two companies whose CEOs he would expect to call before the panel. So needless to say, this is a committee who has somewhat of a unique angle here, that is the alleged influence that China has on U.S. companies. But again, given the broad nature of the Select Committee's mandate, there are multiple ways in which tech companies could, in theory, be called in front of the committee. So with that, I'll stop and turn it back over to David.
Hi, I just wanted to take a moment here to make sure that everyone gets the CLE code for their forms in participation of today's webinar. The CLE code, as shown on screen, is New Year 2023, no spaces between those terms. And if you have not already received your CLE forms, they will be emailed to all participants of today's webinar early next week once we have our recording formatted and everything, so that message will include our CLE forms, a copy of this presentation, and a link to our webinar recording. Next, we'll move on to the Q&A portion of our webinar. So if anyone would like to submit a question to our panel, please use the Q&A box located in your Zoom window, and we'll try to address those questions within the next several minutes before the end of our presentation.
I see a question submitted before the chat on the greatest legislative or regulatory threat to the big tech companies this year. And I'm happy to get that conversation started with my own views being topics that have already come up. I think the China issue is going to continue to be omnipresent, and that there's going to companies need to be prepared to respond on what their dealings are with Chinese companies, where the money is coming from, and what they're doing to secure their networks and services and protect the privacy and cybersecurity and ensure the national security to the extent these networks are used for critical infrastructure purposes or used to supply services to the federal government. I don't see that going away. We've seen Congress give the FCC a lot of direction and a lot of authority to crack down on Chinese companies in the past several years. Congress told the FCC to pursue its rip and replace program and to bar covered list companies from obtaining equipment authorizations. So I think the 1-2 punch there is something to be aware of in the next year as well. I don't know if others have thoughts on greatest threats.
I think, at least in some ways, and this mainly focusing perhaps on the privacy regulation and the landscape, is that given sort of the distrust on both sides, I would say at the extreme ends of both parties about what the motivations are, that even a simple thing like, let's have some reasonable regulation in place, federal, that would protect children from online harms. Seems like you could maybe, I mean, there would be, of course, be some outliers who, maybe not outliers, but some reasonable questions about whether that should be an issue that the federal government is getting inside. But even aside from that, I think you could have on both sides of the aisle at the far extremes complete agreement in that general principle, but what an online harm is for a child will be viewed very differently. So I could see some stagnation, and a lot of it still being driven down to the states, where you'll have different states focusing on perhaps the same issue, but from a very different lens, and just increasing patchwork of privacy, content moderation legislation, and the like that could be just a compliance nightmare and getting even worse.
Yeah, a couple of areas as I'm sort of thinking about this question on the regulatory front. I think the Biden administration will continue in the antitrust space to be very aggressive. I think you don't have to look any further than the FTC's policy statement on their Section 5 authority last November, which seemed to take a very broad interpretation of the authority they have to regulate under Section 5. I think that will continue to sort of drive the competition narrative. I do think legislatively in the competition space, there is a chance for the Open Apps Market Act, the bill that would allow more third-party access to app stores, to pass. That does not seem to generate the same amount of controversy as sort of the bigger antitrust, the American Innovation and Choice Online Act did. And then finally, I think, as James just pointed out, there is a landing spot for federal privacy legislation, either comprehensive or more specific to children. And then one thing, obviously the two parties come at Section 230 from very different points of view. I do think if a group of people wanted to get something done, and sort of avoid the bigger politics of it, I do think requiring increased transparency on what content moderation rules are at various platforms, I think that could be another area. Obviously not as comprehensive or invasive as sort of broader Section 230 reform, but at least bringing some transparency is sort of a spot that Congress likes to land absent, something more comprehensive being able to come together.
I'll just add one fine point on my remarks earlier that, I don't think this is theoretical. I think the tech industry it's not just likely to receive, is already receiving letters from House Republicans and certainly would be surprising if Senate Democrats follow suit, and for companies that that haven't thought through how they would respond to a congressional letter. Now's the time to get your ducks in a row.
I see a question about the SEC's breach notification proposed rule. This came out last year and would require publicly traded companies to make more specified disclosures on their cybersecurity incidents that are experienced and how they reacted and the number of people impacted, and also potentially even further about the qualifications of their board and their staff to address cybersecurity risk. This is one of several efforts we've seen from different agencies to impose greater transparency, greater requirements around cyber incident reporting. The FCC as well has proposed rules right now that have not yet been commented on that would add some rigor to its own reporting rules for when customer information is disclosed. I know that other agencies have their own rules, states do, state AGs are interested in this topic. So I think cybersecurity is one issue we should absolutely have on the table for increased regulatory risk.
Yeah, I think from a legislative perspective, there is a lot of interest in that. I think, and I think there's bipartisan. I think they're coming at it from the same side. I think the devil gets into the details very quickly. So it will be an issue that is investigated, discussed, negotiated. I don't have a good read on how likely legislation is to be enacted in the next 2 years in that space.
And with that, we are at the end of the hour here for our presentation. Thank you very much for joining us today and listening to our very insightful panel. We hope you found this discussion to be informative, and please be on the lookout for that follow-up message, which will include materials covered in today's presentation, as well as your CLE materials. Thank you all for attending.
Thanks, everybody.